Let me introduce the two of you. What an honor, a delicate and beautiful honor to introduce.
Oh, fuck off with the sentimentality.
Just listen for a second.
Jesus Christ.
I know. I have to work sentimentality in because Jake hates it too. So here's what we got. Jake Appleton. This is Sam Morris. Really, two of the smartest, if not the two smartest people in my world. And just in your exploration, it is an honor to introduce the two of you. You share something from me inside of sort of a trauma-driven kind of life that has led to an awareness that is unique entirely as a human. I don't know too many people more unique than the two of you. And underneath it all, they're just two great guys. You both bring such wonder to my life. So it's an honor. Sam Morris, Jake Appleton. Nice to meet you both.
Jake, pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you too.
Looking forward to chatting.
So, Sam, just to put you up to speed, and then I'm going to put Jake up to speed too. So Jake and I have had a pretty hot discussion in the last hour about life. Essentially, the disparity between what it could be and what it is, and kind of the fucked upness of everything that it is to be alive, and some dark corners involved, some tossing and turning and chucking and jiving into looking at those things.
Sounds like a good place for me to come in.
I know, right? It seems like this would be right up your alley, as sometimes Sam goes there pretty easily as well. And
just notice that I naturally have a smirk on my face just in the anticipation of engaging with you, Fred. So this is fun. I don't even know what that's all about. It's just like,
right.
I'm smirking already. I don't even know where the hell we're going with this.
I know, right? It's awesome. So Jake, you do have a pretty awesome smile. Sometimes when happiness comes on through you like that, it's pretty infectious. So why don't you introduce yourself to both me and Sam here? Who the hell are you anyways, Jake, now that we get down to the business?
I don't know. No one.
I love that. Good answer. Good answer.
And is that your final answer? Is that what we're going with?
Well, I'm a human. One among many. I haven't done anything along the lines that people would normally speak of credential-wise.
So you're not a carpenter or a baker or a candlestick maker or nothing like that?
No, though I have done all of those things at one point or another. Candlestick making, not for some time.
Well, you should put that on your resume. That's a good place to start.
Definitely. No, I like where we're going here, though. Keep it broad. Human amongst many. And who really gives a shit about credentials anyway? You had the credentials, Fred, and look what you've done.
I know, right? I know. Yeah, Jake sometimes tells me he's wasted his life. I'm like, dude. And I haven't wasted my life. All the trials and tribulations of living a life with a bunch of credentials and somehow surviving it, I don't know, metabolizing it or transforming it, transmuting it into fuel or a capacity to have a greater or lesser understanding of what this human experience is. It somehow has some perverted value. I don't know.
The credentials are kind of like a vaccine pass for writing drugs to people.
That's it.
The square peg to go in the square hole so that you recognize that other people can make square pegs and square holes. Because who knows what they could make if they can't do that. Also, I always think of, when people ask credentials, I always think of, I think it's a half made up story, but it's at least told by science people that maybe it was Galileo, maybe I'm misremembering, but they dropped 10 pounds of feathers and 10 pounds of steel off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And at the time, everyone believed that things fell differently based on their weight. And they hit the ground at the same time. And people were just like, no, they didn't hit the ground at the same time. It must have been, something went wrong. It couldn't have been that. And no matter how many times the experiment was repeated, people were like, no, you're just some guy. The church tells me that weight matters. So I don't care.
Anyone who saw what actually happened got burned at the stake.
Right.
Yeah, don't let the facts get in the way of the truth kind of thing. Sam, I just realized some connections between the two of you. Sam, how about if you take on, you've heard me ask you this and other people this, who the fuck are you, really, Sam?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I know that whatever answer I give to you is not going to be the answer to who I really am. That's the trick here. It's not like trying to evade the question per se. It's just that we try to fit this contextual understanding of who we are into some sort of linguistic kind of structure, which is predicated upon our past experience and our interests and our color of our skin and the color of our eyes and where we grew up and all this sort of seemingly arbitrary bullshit that has nothing to do with who we actually are.
It can't be an accurate depiction because, if someone looks blue and you're trying to get them to look purple, telling them purple won't get them to look purple. You have to tell them red. It's not a communication of a truth. It's a transformation of what the other person thinks.
There you go. Yeah. So who the fuck are you, Fred Moss? Who are you to be asking us such a question?
Well, now I feel ganged up on him.
You're the one who's persistently asking this.
Well, I just want to know who you think you are. Who do I think I am? I'm someone who's bumbling through and somehow fortunate enough to have the experience of being level every so often so that I can perceive from a still space. Like something about every so often, it all balances enough for me to ask a question or to contribute a piece or explore and learn and laugh at a world that's essentially impossible to understand, though I am addicted to understanding. The bad combination to be addicted to understanding in a world that has zero chance of being
the default human experience.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you just tried to attempt to describe who you are, it was probably the least eloquent and poetic thing I've ever heard you say.
It was somewhat similar to mine in that we described something that ultimately I think everyone feels.
Fred, have you heard of a guy named Paul Selig, a spiritual channel?
I've heard of this guy, but I don't know much about him. Tell me more.
Well, he has this question of who I am, who you are, reminds me of something that his spiritual guides tell him that is a very fundamental affirmation. And that affirmation is, I know who I am in truth, I know what I am in truth, and I know how I serve. And this gets reiterated over and over and over again as incredibly powerful affirmation. But when one is saying, I know who I am in truth, you're speaking to something that is not the impermanent, contextual self of identity and persona, but is the divine presence and consciousness that is beyond all of that impermanent, contextualized stuff. So the question or the statement, I know who I am in truth, doesn't indicate anything about the context of this present lifetime. It's not about what my education is or what my job description is or what my name is. All of that stuff is just history and language, basically, as we remember it and as we choose to formulate it in our minds and structure it in our thoughts. But that's not actually who we are. But I know who I am in truth as an affirmation connects us to that higher awareness, that transcendent consciousness that is our actual selves.
It makes me think of something possibly comically mundane, which is there's a thing in computer science where if you have one thing, it's really two things. You've got the meat of what it is, and then you have the reference to the memory location. And that's what it makes me think of. Like the reference to you is always there and it doesn't change regardless of how you change. It also makes me think of something I was thinking of the other day, that we tend to think that, oh, I'm learning about something. Okay, I saw a tree and then 2 days later I saw the same tree and 3 days later I saw the same tree, and I'm formulating this idea of what the tree is and what it's always been and what it will become. And we may underconsider when things really change. Like we might go, oh, is our interpretation of what we knew getting better, or is what we did know actually changing out from under us? And so I think that trying to even look at the object, the content of what something is at any permanent stage, ultimately there's something you'll miss. It's kind of like how you can't look at the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't look at a particle's position and their speed at the same time. You can only look at one or the other.
Yes, well said. Yeah, this whole persona thing is a real drag. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Today, I was just like, I'm so fucking sick of this whole persona thing. And it's so undynamic. It's like this static image of who I'm supposed to be in order to please other people who need a reference point for me.
Yeah, and it's impossible to get away from. For the people I do know, I'm always trying to like, how do I change how they think of me so it's more accurate of who I want them to be? And for people I don't know, it's how do I create a holistic image of what I think I am such that I can present it as quickly as possible?
Right. And then we spend all of this time, energy, and effort in trying to maintain that persona to a certain degree, just unconsciously, in order to navigate the world and not appear completely fucking crazy. And yet it's so limiting. It's taking the entire universe and it's reducing it down into the most myopic possibility that it can possibly be reduced to.
Yeah, like on one hand, it's good and it's bad, I think. So I've always thought, why limit yourself? Why not say, I'm open to experiencing anything? But then I've realized that in these environments where people are looking for others, they're typically looking for someone who's looking for something. And if you say, I'm looking for anything, no one knows to find you. And I think that, as our group gets larger and larger, the human group or smaller and smaller, more connected, that kind of just taking like a little bit of yourself, like a characterization and saying, oh, this is me. It becomes more and more useful, but it also becomes more and more dangerous. And I think you see those in some certain, like, not that I experienced many of these firsthand, but in some like very modern, like social media things, people are creating very limiting characterizations of themselves because they're speaking to the entire world at once. And, you can only say so much.
I'd love to hear you elaborate on the potential dangers of that.
Well, I think as you were going on kind of there, it's kind of boxing yourself into a specific thing. And then you get into that situation where you craft how people know you. And so if you acted really different, they might, I don't know, I suppose the fear of how they might act. Perhaps they wouldn't act in any strange way that justifies the fear. I think the dangers of lumping us in together, it also kind of, you can't lump together, you can only lump. And so while you're lumping some people together, you're necessarily segregating others in that same action. And so while we do look to say like, oh, I like barbecue chips too, and we bond over that, it's also important to not go in and say, well, you don't like barbecue chips? Well, screw you. It's kind of a double-edged sword. And I think for a long time we were on one side, and then now we're kind of on the other, and, we need to syncopate a little.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider the impulse towards that static identity and all of the reasons why we have that impulse towards a static identity when we are anything but static. There's that tribal safety of feeling that one needs to have a persona which fits in with an existing tribe that one is familiar with. There is the financial piece where you feel like unless I market an image of myself, either to my boss or if I am someone who markets myself as an entrepreneur or whatever, I need to give people a consistent image of who I am so that they know what they are buying if they are choosing to purchase my services or whatever. Or there are any number of reasons why we have that impulse to create a static persona in an inherently dynamic universe. And yet at the same time, it seems to be the ultimate form of bondage. I think about one of my favorite performers, David Bowie, who was always shedding his skin. It was as soon as he had created a persona that he lived in for a while, he got sick of it and created a new one. And he was always moving and always willing to keep adapting. And he went through a lot of different, not only sort of personas, but really, in a way, sort of archetypal embodiments of humanity over the course of his creative career. And so if you look at an interview with Bowie from 1972 or 73, he was a very different Bowie than he was in, say, 1992 or 2004. There was different archetypal expressions of humanity that were expressing through him over the course of one physical lifetime.
I wonder if that's almost like the ideal experience, to maintain the ability to kind of choose your path while still going up in the path. Like, I think that one of the risks of maintaining your ability to choose many paths is that you don't take any of them. But if you have that kind of money and power, you can switch around and still kind of rise, and perhaps the willingness to switch around and still embody oneself or kind of wholeheartedly embrace that switching around. Maybe that's perhaps part of what contributed to that fame.
Yeah. And I suppose with many people, it would not have been possible to maintain such a dynamic experience. I mean, every single time he shifted his identity, he took a major risk because, of course, his fans are going to be drawn to a certain persona. There's going to be the Ziggy Stardust fans who want Ziggy Stardust. They want to go to that show and feel Ziggy Stardust. And he's like, fuck it, I'm done with Ziggy Stardust. And I'm sure that he lost, a huge portion of his fan base when he moved past the Ziggy Stardust sort of persona. And I'm sure there was a lot of people who were really connecting on an emotional level with that character. And he's like, I'm done with that character. And some of those people, they have to go through what they have to go through. And his career had to go through what it went through. And somehow he was able to keep on finding new audiences and creating something new. But I don't think that would work for a lot of performers. And I think about some of the bands out there. I mean, nothing wrong with them, but Rolling Stones are playing the same goddamn music they were playing in the late 60s. And it's like they are essentially being a caricature of themselves from 1967 or whatever, when they're playing that music.
Really tough to not. I think so few people, I think that there's a really harsh line between advertising and art. And when you're an artist, you can get really popular. And then as soon as you get really popular, it switches into advertisement and you're locked into your persona.
Right.
And someone like, I'm sure that Bowie's investors were like freaking out all the time. Yeah. But, to be able to maintain that artistry of, no, I'm doing what I want is pretty rare.
Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you for this discussion. I was there, and I think neither of you were there when Ziggy became Diamond Dog. And I was way Ziggy at the time. I loved that album. It was my favorite album for several years. I know every song and every word on that album. I still listen to it on occasion. There's never been another album created quite like Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And the whole transgender persona, if you will, grew out of Ziggy Stardust. We are still seeing that. We are still seeing Ziggy Stardust all over this world. Ziggy Stardust continues to leak all over this world. And it isn't like Ziggy Stardust existed before David Bowie created Ziggy Stardust. It was like Ziggy Stardust and everything that goes into ambiguity of sexuality and, your parents being afraid of you and the whole idea of Suffragette City and the whole idea of teenage rock and roll suicide or 5 years or all those things are still hit home today. Now, when Diamond Dogs came on and Ziggy and David Bowie had now changed his persona drastically, and then soon after that, changed it again and changed it again and changed it again. One thing I'm hearing that I really would love to hear your comments about is that we now have a persona about who David Bowie is as the one who changed his persona many times. So in some ways, we are stuck still in being able to say something like, well, that's like David Bowie, or, that he still represent, unique as he might have been walking through the world, not might have been, he made it his business to do things differently than anyone like him. We now have something called a Bowie archetype that we at least lean on as we're talking about him now. Like we know what we think we're saying when we're saying he's Bowie, that's in some ways caught up anyways. Despite the fact that we can talk about it, being like Bowie is just like being like a banker or being like a suburban mom or, it's like just like another archetype.
Let me see if I can sort of relate to what you're saying here, Fred, because I think I can. It's kind of like if the typical person is sort of one flavor, then maybe Bowie was 7 flavors. And now we've got a certain sort of type of person who can be a 7 flavor person versus just a 1 flavor person. But yet that still creates a certain type of person who's a 7 flavor person who evolves. And it still doesn't speak to the vastness of the infinite that is actually our full dynamic possibility at any given time. It's just a 7-flavor individual versus a 1-flavor individual. It's a little more interesting, a little more dynamic than a 1-flavor individual, but it's still an individual. It's still a 7-flavor kind of version. And so is that, I see you nodding your head. Is that resonating?
Yeah, exactly. And around that same time, by the way, this speaking of the flavors, around that same time, in the same approximate era, believe it or not, give or take 2 or 3 years, and I even wonder about the weird connection here, Baskin and Robbins came out, and 31 flavors was a freaking deal. It was a deal, dude. There were 3 flavors beforehand. There was chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, and Neapolitan. And that was it. That is all you got. And then here came chocolate marshmallow and Rocky Road. And to go to Baskin and Robbins was to expand your consciousness in the world of ice cream at the age of 9 is when I'm talking about it here, which is a little earlier perhaps than Ziggy. Not that much earlier, actually, because I was born in 58. And I think Ziggy is not that much earlier. It's about the same fucking year, actually. So there was like an expansion of consciousness that when we went to Baskin and Robbins, it was like a circus. It was like a circus, really. Like the goal at some point was to at least get a spoonful of the other 28 flavors. And yet now it's just ice cream. There's just like, I don't know, 60 or 200 types of ice cream, and we still reduce it. Reduction, we reductionistically reduce it into a one thing, into a myopic one thing. I still feel imprisoned by it, compared to the vastness of what the universe has to offer for all things everywhere. I mean, it's still way a dot in the, 1 grain of sand in the vastness of the universe.
And there are plenty of ice cream flavors that don't ever make it, like grass. That's why I like Birdie Bots. I really like those. One of my favorite inventions is those terrible flavored jelly beans.
Oh, yeah.
Like this one tastes like sweaty socks, and this one tastes like rotten cheese. And it's like, this is candy. Humans made this. The silliest thing I've ever encountered. But I think what that all touches on is kind of the inherent issue with learning, is that learning is a powerful tool. It allows us to group things together and say, well, I've seen something like that before, so I can respond in a similar way. But it will always limit our ability. It's like, and I was thinking about something that could perhaps come into, just imaginary, something that could perhaps come into our reality that didn't learn by learning and abuse us learning creatures. All you have to do for something that learns, all you have to do is have them run up against a wall once, and then you just have to project images of walls all around them and they stop moving. It's like the amount of effort it takes to control a being that learns is very little, because you can cause them to learn exactly what you want them to do. And then they see the walls that they've bumped into before. So there's a real, very delicate balance that's constantly swinging back and forth of how much do I trust what I've learned versus how much do I abandon what I've learned.
Well said. And there's an energy expenditure that is, in order to evolve and learn new things, there's always some type of energy expenditure involved in that process. And our neural networks are established and have evolved around trying to limit the amount of input as much as possible so that we can survive on the very basic understanding of our physical environment and our social environment. And so any kind of additional learning to stretch out of that box requires an energy expenditure. And I think that that's where, it's very challenging for myself included to keep evolving, because it requires going into the unknown, doing so willingly, and spending energy there in the unknown with creating. And in a certain way, the human brain was not really well established around creating. It was kind of evolved around limiting the amount of creativity in order to survive its environment.
Yeah, we're pretty bad at creating, because I think exactly because we came from this survival environment. So we create these tools about facilitating what we didn't have rather than what we did have. We say, oh, while we were living in our natural environment, we were afraid constantly. We were hungry. And so we say, we're going to build this world where we're never afraid and we're never hungry. And it's like, well, no, what we need is both. It's that the technology back then was built to kind of bring us out of what we were born in. But now that it's everything, it needs to be both halves.
I wonder if we have some kind of inherent impulse towards making ourselves hungry and afraid again so that we can continue to evolve.
Right. I think we do see a raise in kind of emotional masochism as we move further and further into this overprotective environment where we're not even kind of allowed to put ourselves in danger. At least we're not allowed to put our kids in danger.
I know. That's why I'm going to buy some children that I can put into danger. Borrow some for a few days. Wait, is that okay these days? Can we borrow children if we don't tell the parents? Is that the same as kidnapping when you borrow children and you don't tell their parents?
I think it depends on how you frame it. Maybe if they got stuck in a tree and you simply didn't help them down.
Fred, you actually raised actual physical children, the real kind.
I did.
What were your experiences with trying to find that balance between keeping them safe and allowing them to take risks?
It's a great question. I think that early on, when Bennett was first born, I wanted him to experience all of life, including the danger. But there was something about when push came to shove, I would protect him from danger. But I took him to places that were
whorehouses.
Yeah, horse. I mean, what are you going to do if you got to have a whore and you're babysitting your kid?
Crack house.
What are you going to do when you need a line?
You need to buy some crack and your kid's with you. I mean,
what are you going to do? You tell me what to do.
It's like grandma's soothing syrup. I think that had like meth and opium, and that was a baby's serum. So
Bennett got some early experiences,
but Bennett was probably not naturally drawn to the same type of wild lifestyle that Fred Moss was growing up, though, yeah?
Well, he learned through honest stories about what his dad did and somehow he really got to a place where he chose not. He knew he could. He's let his friends do it, and he learned that some of the things I did to scorch myself or to walk like blindly into danger, he didn't have to do.
You didn't get grilled by police in gas station parking lots about a hash deal gone wrong?
No, he didn't have to have that experience. Mm-hmm. Yep, it's true. He didn't. Thanks for bringing that up. It's true. It's a good reminder that, I mean, he's had a blessed life and he's such a fun child and he understands danger at a very high level. So that's what I'm thinking. I spoke with him yesterday because, he's from Cincinnati. He lives in Dallas, and the Bengals, our Cincinnati Bengals, are going to the Super Bowl, against these LA Rams. And he was like on seventh heaven, about his Bengals going to the Super Bowl. So when he was a teenager, my life was very tumultuous. And sometimes I had to make decisions that put my kids at more risk than I'm proud of during their teenage years. And this is no longer just funny jokes about whorehouses and crack houses. This is just real. I think that Bennett was so aligned with me that he never let go and he never clutched. He stayed with me and watched the world from the world of a teenager, trusting somehow, like against better judgment. I don't know how he did it, trusting somehow that his dad would get through this okay. And it's worked out to this point so that he won. Hannah, on the other hand, my daughter, at one point flinched. At one point, it's like, no, Dad, I'm not living this life with you. So she stopped living this life with me, especially with the pull of her mom, who was more interested in keeping her safe. It really did alter the way that Hannah grew up because we ended up having a significant amount of time separated from each other. And at least my assessment of that is because I was too dangerous. I was too dangerous during the years that she rightfully chose not to hang out with me so that she could live a more protected and so-called safe life. So that's what I have for this answer for now.
Oh, thank you. And I appreciate your honesty about it.
Yeah. I love, we're both good now. Well, all three of us are good, really good now. And what it took about being good, I think, is to just come clean with each other about that time. And we've had discussions as adults about what those years really look like from each of our perspectives. And so there's something like being able to get on the other side of any past experience by at least ferreting it out, combing it out and being as honest as possible and vulnerable and about the pain or about the indecisions or the bad decisions that got made at various times. And it seems like there's healing on the other side of taking this stuff on directly. That's what I have to say about that parenting question. I had 4 kids, right? So when I was married the second time, I had 2 daughters. And so we had 4 kids for quite a while, about 7 years. That's a long time. And I was actually with Rachel and Paige more often than I was with Ben and Hannah because they stayed with us permanently. And my goodness, trying to figure out where to even go to be safe isn't always, which safety is safe? Is it safer to go out there or is it safer to stay home? Is it safer to see it or is it safer to not see it? It's not clear what safety really is.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no absolute there to refer to. In fact, I mean, if you think about it, there are a lot of families who have the wealth and privilege which allows for a really high degree of safety in theory as they raise their children. And it's some of those children who ultimately become incredibly dysfunctional because of the fact that they have been kept in such a protected container for as long as they have and haven't been exposed to the challenges which forge human resilience.
Now, this is really interesting. So there was no introduction, Jake, between, what we get to talk about sometimes and what Sam just said, but I'm going to trust you can see at least an interface between what Sam just said and what we even were talking about last hour, this idea of the effects of a cocoon or the effects of of not getting out there in an entirely different source, though. It's not like you're overprotected, but there is a decrease or a self-proclaimed anyways, and please don't let me speak too much for you here, but a self-proclaimed decrease in your sensory experiences, that you're closed down. You find yourself closed down for whatever reason, and you're living life from that space. Might you have something to say on the interface of, what we're saying here? There's the suburban overprotective family who, by protecting their kids so much, leave us with dysfunctional freaks. And then there's also the event of staying sensory deprived, or at least in a self-proclaimed way, sensory deprived, and the impact of what that is. And I wonder if you can speak to the comparison and the contrast of those two similar outcomes with different pathways to get there.
First, it makes me think of, there was a study, and maybe I can find it somewhere, but it was a study done on amoebas. And it was basically studying amoeba, just kind of negative environmental stimuli. So how acidic is the environment? How hot is the environment? And they found that if they removed all of the negative stimulus, that they gave the amoebas exactly what they want, the perfect acidity, the perfect amount of food, the perfect temperature, that they all die. And that what was necessary was kind of the chaos of building that environment. And I think that because we're storytellers, we tend to think that the most impressive story is the hardest to go through. Like, getting hit by a car sounds a lot worse than getting hit by a bike. But obviously that's kind of a hard example. But I think what it's more about is the ramping up. What the hardest thing to overcome is poor ramping. It's not something like humans can overcome any difficulty in their life as long as they get appropriate feedback to say, okay, actions have consequences. What you can do can impact what you get. And then you can defeat this, and you can defeat this, and you can defeat this. And so I think that what's not important is protecting us from those dangers or giving us to those dangers. It's really a very, very specific kind of level design, if you will, of when do you give the person, the player, the pleasurable experiences or hard experiences. If nothing's ever hard, it's not fun. But if it's too hard, they give up. It's a very delicate balance that we don't seem to be taking any strides meticulous. Like, we don't really seem to be trying to balance that at all. We seem to just kind of, I guess we don't really have much central cohesiveness. We just kind of do what we want, what the people vote for at the time.
Makes me think about the relationship between proactive pressure and reactive pressure as well. That nature and evolution naturally is a byproduct of pressures. There's any pressure on any system is required in order for that system to evolve, whether that is the system of a biological system of a single individual or other type of system. But any system requires a certain amount of pressure to be able to evolve. So if there is adequate pressure that is proactively placed on oneself towards a desired outcome, then you have growth. If that pressure isn't applied, then something will come in to apply pressure against it in order to get it to grow, because otherwise it's just in a state of inertia or dying. So something will inevitably come in to shake that system up and make it grow. And it seems that if enough proactive pressure is placed on a system in order to grow, then when some external pressure comes along, that system is already resilient enough to be able to handle an external pressure better than it might have been able to otherwise. And the way that I can relate to this personally is through my own experience with my spinal cord injury. By the time my spinal cord injury happened when I was 24, fortunately, I had put enough proactive pressures on myself to be able to adapt to the spinal cord injury without too much self-destruction. Now, had the spinal cord injury happened absent any proactive pressures that I'd put on myself, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know that I would have been prepared to manage it without going into a state of self-destruction.
It's interesting that you tie the self-destruction in at that very moment, because it's almost a reaction. It's, oh, there hasn't been enough pressure, so put more pressure. And it's like right there. It's so very direct that not enough external destruction, self-destruct. It's a solution. It just sometimes, again, if you don't like ramp up those or that destruction in enough amounts, you don't build that tolerance, and that destruction can end you outright.
Let me do what I'm trained to do as a podcaster. If you don't mind, I'd like to give some practice to this. We are at I would say, in the world of peaks and valleys, we're talking about something pretty root level at this point. And I'd like to consider like a pivot. And the pivot would be towards, maybe I'm hearing something a little bit like alchemy here, a little bit towards a solution, a way to find grace and ease, or a way to find and honor divinity, eternity, our providential sense of self that we've touched on a couple times, this what we aren't, this thing that we aren't, this thing that we're not wired to pay attention to in its broadest space. Is there an access towards having a life that actually honors the complexity and infinite nature of eternity and divinity? Is there something that three guys kicking it on a Monday night can access that really points towards living into that which we say escapes us or is outside our reach or needs to have external pressures? Or do we have access to something like that?
You tell me.
Well, I think basically, I don't know. What it makes me think of is we're always kind of like, well, we're going to die. And so we struggle against preserving everything of not death. I mean, it's all about replicating. It's all about making more of yourself, right? You can heal your skin, and that's a way to make more of yourself, or you can make babies, and that's a way to make more of yourself. So I think that the only way to kind of transcend this fear of always being destroyed, and I think it's kind of the point of life forms, is to just make ourselves as much as possible. And the way to do that is to kind of contribute to the larger entity, right? We will die, but people talk about life after death as though it doesn't exist. And I'm like, well, look right there. That thing, that's alive. That dead thing, that's alive. That's life after death. Your body doesn't go anywhere. You're still there. All your parts are there. I think that there's no real reason to believe that experience stops when you become discohesive, because I think that it seems to be the case that experience can exist without consciousness. So if the machine that creates consciousness falls apart, the experience probably still exists, just in a very discohesive way. A grain of dirt can't tell you if it feels like it's being stepped on, but it still gets stepped on and it still responds. So I think basically we're all one conglomerate entity. And the way to kind of outlive death is to just contribute to the entity that will live longer than you'll live. It's like each of our individual cells only has 7 years at most, I think is the number, that all of our cells can only at max live 7 years. But they contribute to us in such a way that we continue on. And it's almost like they're still alive. It's almost like the cells that you were when you were a baby are still there. They're not at all, but what they were accomplishing is still there because they were able to contribute to an entity larger than themselves that's able to live longer. Ultimately, that entity still approaches the same futility that the little entity did, that, oh, I can't do anything. I have to contribute to larger entities. And then it's just like going, turtles all the way down or all the way up.
Turtles all the way up. I love that.
What you're talking about here, Jake, reminds me very much of the Indian philosopher Krishnamurti, who I've referenced many times over the course of the years in his discourses about the subject of death, because he said that our biggest challenge with death is we don't understand what the hell we're talking about when we're talking about death, because we don't understand what life actually is. So there's this confusion that life is synonymous with continuity. And what we are thinking about when we are thinking about life is we're thinking about that which is continuous. We think about the continuity of our bank accounts, the continuity of our mortgage on our homes, the continuity of our cars. When we talk about something's lifespan, we talk about it in terms of its linear continuity. But that has nothing to do with what life and death actually are. Life is a ever-present state that includes infinite dimensions of consciousness, and it is not something that is reducible down to the structure of continuity and our time management systems that our brains create that think that they are perceiving life and death, but actually aren't perceiving life or death at all.
Right. I think it boils down to the issue with learning again. We want continuity to mean lack of life because that's all we have to go off. Like it was here, it's not here, it probably won't come back. I had this interesting discussion with someone once that they believed that life forms are continuous, that species need to be continuous. And I asked them, well, so we have the opportunity to bring back mammoths as a species. If we brought them back and they went discontinuous for a while, would they still be alive? And they couldn't answer that question. They're like, I don't know. Again, I wouldn't define life by that continuity, so I would say they were alive. But it's a really interesting example where we have a very definite break in continuity. Is it resurrection or is life and death an illusion? And so I think that ultimately healing, we say like, oh, you're dead now. It's like, oh, that person's dead. Well, is their DNA still there? Do they have like some gum or some hair on the bottom of their shoe that we can bring back 100 million years later and have them be here? It's like when Abe Lincoln was alive, we thought that a bullet wound through the back of your head, he's dead. Like, well, nowadays he's not dead. And in 200 years, someone who was pronounced legally dead today may not be pronounced legally dead then. Or maybe even someone who was pronounced legally dead today can be alive then. And I guess
there's a lot of people who are alive who are legally dead. I've met a lot of these people. Most of my practice has been meeting those people straight up.
Well, I think ultimately that's all of our experience, because I think that, they're still alive, just like our cells. Even though the cells have died, the work is still there. And that's what's important. Like the people who contributed to making this computer interface such that we can have this conversation basically facilitated this conversation more so than any of us.
True.
Well said.
That's very true.
Yeah, I mean, what you're pointing here, Fred, around the degree of living while being in a biological body with consciousness is probably the majority of people that I've seen are semi-dead already, because the lights simply aren't on. If we define consciousness define life not by continuity, but by degree of light that is available inside of the body, the degree of light that's shining within that vessel, there's a whole lot of people who are plenty dead a long time before their biological vessel expires.
Interesting. And again, that goes a little bit back to what we were saying about Bowie and about flavors, this idea that if the reason to stay alive is simply to have a body that's slightly locomotive and be able to utter a few words or eat a few pieces of food or, bank a little bit of currency or whatever, if that's the ultimate life, then that only takes vanilla to get that done. Rocky Road doesn't have a place in that world as being even important or interesting. There's no curiosity that really calls for a multi-flavor experience or 7 different ways to be Bowie.
It's kind of worse because you could spend your time appreciating what tasting is and how good this vanilla tastes. Or you could be like, I want to taste that, I want to taste that, I want to taste that, I want to taste that. And then you're never satisfied.
Yeah, that makes sense too. This idea of being satisfied by finally getting it all.
There's a Pink Floyd line. all there was and all there.
Yeah, all that. Yeah,
that one.
Yeah. So it's the last line before they say, "I'll see you on the dark side of the moon."
Right, and it's just like, everything that you've experienced that's it. It's all there's gonna be. And so I think learning to appreciate that is a lot more important than saying, I want to experience everything I could possibly experience before I die, which is kind of, you can't sell appreciating what you have, but you can sell trying 200 million different things.
All right, here we go. And this is, I think we're going to hit this. All that you touch and all that you see, all that you taste, all you feel, and all that you love and all that you hate, all you distrust, all you save, all that you give, all that you deal, all that you buy, beg, borrow, and steal, and all you create and all you destroy and all that you do and all that you say and all that you eat and everyone you meet and all that you slight and everyone you fight and all that is now and all that is gone and all that's to come and everything under the sun is in tune. But the sun is eclipsed by the moon.
I was thinking of breathe. All you touch and all you see is all your life will ever be.
Okay, cool. All right. I am ready to call this podcast a deal, but I am not ready to call this conversation over. But in order for this to even be something that others can benefit from, and frankly, I think there's going to be a lot of benefit from this particular podcast, I'm going to cut it off here in a moment or two. I've learned through my podcasting lessons that the length of a podcast should be not much longer than 47 to 60 minutes because people see a longer one than that. And unless they're stuck at home, which of course both of you tend to be, so you don't really get this. But for us abnormal people who actually attempt to do shit outside of our home, it's important to have a podcast that's under 60 minutes so that people tap in because we're all in a hurry to get off to do the next shit. And you guys are like, oh, cool, a 2-hour podcast.
Don't mess with me, Fred. I know you never leave Valentino the cat.
Look, Valentino showed up earlier today in our Jake conversation, actually.
I found 6 5.5-hour videos in series the other day. I'm like, great, awesome.
I know, right? Background. I know. Sometimes Sam sends me some shit. He's like, Fred, you got to check this conversation. I look at it, it's like 3 hours and 10 minutes. I'm like, Sam, that's going to take me like 3 years to get that shit done. Oh, my God. So in closing, let's say fare thee well. But before we do that, I'd like to get a little piece from both of you about where you're left at the end of this conversation, should you choose to speak to that. So let's start with Jake. If anywhere, Jake, I get that this locks you in and you don't like this stuff, and that's fine. But if there's something you want to say about at the end of the conversation, help us, taper it or create our next conversation, what might that be?
I don't know, like lead into the next one. It's hard to create a transition without knowing what's on the other side.
There you go. That's great enough right there. I love it. Thank you. That's good. And Mr. M, what do you got?
I just like knowing that there's a Jake out there and that there's a Fred out there. If there's a Jake and a Fred, there's an awful lot of other interesting people out there too. So what's up, interesting people?
That's just kind. I appreciate that. I learned that I'm a migrator in the world of human design. As a migrator, apparently one of my skills is to put people
That's together. A thing in human desigin? That's an actual thing?
It is.
It's a class?
It is.
What do they make up, like 1.2% of 1%?
I don't know. I'll have to talk. I think it's human design. It might be Gene Keys, but whatever it is, I'm a migrator. And what I do is put really interesting people together, and then eventually I become insignificant and I move on to the next act. So it's really, really an honor to put the two of you together. I think part of both of you hopefully sees why I did this and why I thought it would be a good match, and I think it is. So thanks for a conversation with two of the more fascinating people in my life. And, we didn't even have to talk about the medical complex, and we sure could have. So
I appreciate your future insignificance.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to that shit.